"You'll never be anything but a disappointment." Those were the words my father chose to say to me in front of 23 executives, 6 department heads, and every member of our leadership team. The conference room went silent so fast that I could hear the hum of the air conditioner above us. No one looked at me. No one looked at him either. They all suddenly became fascinated by their laptops, notebooks, and coffee cups. I sat there at the head of the table, staring at the quarterly report projected onto the screen, trying to process what had just happened. My name was Ethan Walker. I was 38 years old, the founder and CEO of a company worth more than $10 million. I employed over 150 people across 3 states. Yet somehow, with a single sentence, my father managed to make me feel like I was 12 years old again. I slowly closed the folder in front of me and nodded. "Thank you for your feedback, Dad," I said calmly. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Harold Walker leaned back in his chair with the same expression he had worn my entire life whenever he looked at me. Disappointment, judgment, certainty that I would never be enough. The meeting continued, but I barely heard the numbers being discussed. Revenue growth, expansion plans, new contracts. None of it mattered in that moment. All I could think about was how familiar this feeling was. The feeling of working harder than everyone else in the room and still being told it wasn't enough. When the meeting finally ended, people filed out quietly. A few offered polite smiles. Others avoided eye contact altogether. My father remained seated. "You should learn not to take things so personally," he said while gathering his papers. "I'm just telling the truth." Then he walked out. I stayed behind for several minutes, staring through the glass wall of the conference room at the employees moving through the office. Most of them had no idea what had happened. They saw a successful company. They saw a confident CEO. They saw growth, opportunity, and stability. What they didn't see was the history behind that one sentence. They didn't know that my father had spent most of my life reminding me of my shortcomings. They didn't know that every achievement had been followed by criticism. Every success had somehow become evidence that I could have done even better. When I got straight A's in high school, he asked why I wasn't taking more advanced classes. When I earned a business degree, he questioned whether it was from a prestigious enough university. When I started my company from a tiny rented office with secondhand furniture, he called it a phase. When the business survived its first year, he called it luck. When it survived 5 years, he called it temporary. And now, after 15 years of sacrifice, 18-hour workdays, missed holidays, sleepless nights, and risks that could have ruined me financially, I was still hearing the same message. Disappointment. I finally stood and walked toward my office. Through the large windows, I could see the city skyline stretching across the horizon. Years earlier, I had stared at that same skyline while wondering whether I could build something meaningful. Now I owned a corner office overlooking it. I had everything I once dreamed about having. Everything except the one thing I had spent my entire life chasing. My father's respect. What I didn't know then was that 3 weeks later, Harold Walker would no longer have a place in the company I built. And for the first time in my life, I would stop asking for his approval. After everyone left that afternoon, I remained in my office longer than usual. The sun slowly sank behind the buildings downtown, casting long shadows across the floor. I loosened my tie and stared at the framed photograph sitting on the corner of my desk. It had been taken 15 years earlier, back when the company was nothing more than an idea and a rented workspace barely larger than a storage unit. I remembered that first office clearly. 400 square feet, stained carpet, a flickering fluorescent light that buzzed constantly overhead. I had purchased a used desk for $40 and borrowed 2 folding chairs from a friend. Back then, I believed hard work could solve almost anything. I believed that if I worked long enough and sacrificed enough, people would eventually see my value. Most of all, I believed my father would. In those days, I often called him for advice. I would tell him about a new client or a contract I was chasing. His responses were always the same. He would ask how much money I was losing. He would remind me that most small businesses failed. He would suggest applying for a stable corporate job instead. At first, I thought he was trying to protect me. Later, I realized he simply did not believe I could succeed. There were months when I barely made rent. I lived in a tiny apartment with outdated appliances and furniture purchased from thrift stores. I drove an old pickup truck with more than 200,000 miles on the odometer. Some weeks I survived on instant noodles and frozen dinners because every available dollar went back into the business. Yet every morning I showed up before sunrise and left long after dark. I answered customer emails, handled sales calls, packed shipments, managed invoices, and cleaned the office myself. There were no shortcuts, no wealthy investors, no family money, just persistence. During the third year, the company nearly collapsed. A major client canceled a contract worth almost half our annual revenue. I remember sitting alone at my desk after midnight staring at spreadsheets and wondering whether I should finally quit. That night I called my father. I thought perhaps he would encourage me. Instead, he said something I never forgot. He told me that maybe failure was the universe trying to tell me I was pursuing the wrong dream. The next morning I got up and went back to work anyway. Somehow we survived. Then we grew. 1 employee became 5. 5 became 20. 20 became 50. New clients arrived. Revenue increased. We opened a second location, then a third. Newspapers wrote articles about our growth. Industry groups invited me to speak at conferences. People began calling me successful. My father never did. Even after the company became profitable, he found reasons to dismiss what I had built. If revenue increased, it was because of market conditions. If we landed a major contract, it was because we got lucky. If we won an award, he questioned the credibility of the organization giving it. Nothing counted. Nothing changed his opinion. Looking back, I realize I spent years trying to prove something to a man who had already made up his mind. As darkness settled outside my office window, I finally placed the photograph face down on my desk. For the first time, a question entered my mind that I had spent years avoiding. What if my father was never going to be proud of me? And what if everything that happened next depended on finally accepting that truth? The next morning, I arrived at the office before anyone else. The building was quiet except for the faint sound of the cleaning crew finishing their work on the upper floors. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, watching the city wake up. For years, that view had filled me with pride. That morning, it filled me with questions. The more I thought about my father's behavior during the meeting, the more something felt different. His criticism was not new. I had heard it my entire life. What bothered me was the confidence behind it. Harold had not spoken like a disappointed father. He had spoken like someone who believed he held real authority. As employees began arriving, I pushed the thought aside and focused on work. Meetings filled the morning. Calls filled the afternoon. Yet small things started catching my attention. A senior manager who normally reported directly to me mentioned receiving instructions from my father. A purchasing decision had been approved without my knowledge. A vendor contract had been revised even though I had not reviewed it. None of these issues were major on their own. Together, they created a pattern I could not ignore. Around 3 o'clock, I called my executive assistant, Lisa, into my office. She had been with the company for nearly 10 years and knew every department better than anyone. I asked a simple question. Had my father become more involved recently? Her hesitation answered before her words did. She carefully explained that Harold had been attending more meetings over the past few months. He often requested reports directly from department heads. Several managers believed he was preparing for a larger leadership role. I thanked her and ended the conversation, but a strange feeling settled in my stomach. I walked through the office for the next hour, observing things I had previously overlooked. Employees greeted me warmly, but there was uncertainty behind some of their smiles. Conversations stopped when I approached. Doors closed more quickly than usual. It was subtle, almost invisible. Yet once I noticed it, I could not stop seeing it. That evening, I stayed late again. Most of the lights had been turned off by the time I opened the internal reporting system. I began reviewing records from the previous 6 months. At first, everything appeared normal. Then I noticed several approvals carrying my father's authorization. That surprised me because his advisory position did not include decision-making authority. I dug deeper. More approvals appeared. Additional recommendations. Strategic planning sessions I had never been informed about. The deeper I looked, the more uncomfortable I became. It felt as though another version of the company had been operating alongside the one I thought I was running. A version where conversations happened without me. Decisions were shaped without me. Influence was growing in directions I had not noticed. Shortly before midnight, I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. For years, I had assumed my greatest challenge was earning my father's respect. Now I was beginning to wonder whether respect had never been his goal. Maybe he had wanted something else entirely. The possibility seemed unfair. It seemed paranoid. Yet the evidence sitting on my computer screen refused to disappear. I shut down the monitor and stared into the darkness of my office. Somewhere along the way, the story had changed. This was no longer about criticism. It was no longer about old family wounds. Something much larger was unfolding behind the scenes, and for the first time, I realized I might not fully understand who my father had become. The following week brought answers I had not been looking for. They arrived quietly, hidden inside ordinary conversations and routine reports. On Tuesday morning, I attended a budget review with several department leaders. Normally, these meetings focused on forecasts and operational goals. This time, something fell off from the moment I entered the room. People were careful with their words. They exchanged brief glances before answering simple questions. More than once, someone referenced a discussion that had apparently taken place without me. I kept my expression neutral and listened. By the end of the meeting, I had learned more from what was not said than from what was. Later that afternoon, I met with Karen, our chief financial officer. She had worked beside me for nearly 8 years and was one of the few people whose judgment I trusted completely. As we reviewed quarterly projections, she hesitated before opening another file. Then she asked a question that caught me off guard. She wanted to know whether I had approved a long-term restructuring proposal. I told her I had never seen such a proposal. The confusion on her face immediately concerned me. She turned her monitor toward me and showed me a document containing recommendations for leadership changes, reporting adjustments, and authority transfers. Several sections included notes from my father. My pulse slowed instead of speeding up. Years of building a business had taught me that panic rarely improved a situation. Facts mattered. Emotions did not. I carefully read every page. The proposal stopped short of removing me from leadership, but the direction was obvious. Key responsibilities would gradually shift away from my office. Decision-making authority would become more distributed. New committees would be created. Certain executives would begin reporting elsewhere. None of it appeared dramatic. That was what made it dangerous. The changes were designed to happen slowly enough that most people would never notice. After Karen left, I sat alone and replayed recent months in my head. Suddenly, events that once seemed unrelated began fitting together. My father requesting additional reports, private lunches with senior managers, informal strategy sessions, frequent conversations behind closed doors. Each memory felt like another puzzle piece sliding into place. The realization was unsettling, but not because of the business implications. What troubled me most was remembering how excited I had been when he first joined the company. I had interpreted his interest as support. I had believed that after years of doubt, he finally wanted to stand beside me. Instead, it appeared he had been building influence from the moment he arrived. That evening, I drove home through heavy traffic and found myself thinking about my mother. Margaret had often acted as the bridge between my father and me. Whenever tensions rose, she found ways to smooth things over. A few days later, I invited her to lunch. We met at a quiet restaurant near the river. During the conversation, I mentioned some of the recent changes at work. She listened carefully but seemed unsurprised. Then she said something I could not stop thinking about afterward. She told me that my father had always struggled when someone else held the spotlight. Success came naturally to him when he controlled the outcome. Watching someone else build something significant was much harder. The drive back to the office felt longer than usual. For the first time, I considered a possibility that had never crossed my mind before. Maybe this situation was not about my shortcomings at all. Maybe it was about my father's inability to accept that the company no longer belonged to his generation. And if that was true, the decisions he made next could force me into a position I had spent my entire life trying to avoid. Over the next several days, I stopped looking for explanations and started looking for evidence. The difference was important. Explanations depend on assumptions. Evidence does not. I quietly reviewed internal communications, meeting summaries, and planning documents. I was careful not to draw attention to what I was doing. The company still needed to function. Employees still deserved stability. Clients still expected results. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, everything had. The first major discovery came from a department review scheduled weeks earlier. While comparing organizational charts, I noticed several reporting lines had been altered. Managers who had traditionally reported to executive leaders were now participating in informal advisory groups connected to my father. The changes seemed harmless at first glance. There were no announcements, no official restructuring, yet influence was clearly moving. It reminded me of watching a river slowly change direction. Day to day, the movement was invisible. Over time, the entire landscape shifted. What surprised me most was how many people assumed these changes had my approval. More than once, a manager mentioned conversations that began with the phrase, "Harold said this was the direction leadership wanted to go." Leadership, not advice, not recommendations. Leadership, the distinction mattered. One afternoon, I met with Daniel, one of our longest-serving operations directors. He had joined the company when we had fewer than 15 employees. We spoke privately in a conference room overlooking the parking lot. At first, he seemed hesitant. Then he admitted that several executives believed a major transition was being planned. When I asked what kind of transition, he looked uncomfortable. Finally, he told me that some people expected my father to take a more active role in directing the company. The statement hung in the air between us. I thanked him for his honesty and ended the meeting. Driving home that evening, I replayed every conversation from the past year. The pattern was impossible to ignore now. My father had never openly challenged my position. He had done something far more effective. He had allowed others to imagine a future where his authority continued to grow. The next morning, another piece of the puzzle appeared. Karen stopped by my office carrying several financial review folders. As we discussed routine matters, she casually mentioned a consulting agreement being drafted for strategic governance planning. The phrase immediately caught my attention. I asked to see the preliminary documents. What I found was not illegal, unethical, or dramatic. It was simply revealing. The proposal outlined a future governance structure that would gradually concentrate more influence among a small group of senior advisors. My father's name appeared repeatedly throughout the draft. Mine appeared less often than expected for someone who had founded the company. I sat quietly after Karen left. The office felt unusually still. Outside my window, employees moved through their day completely unaware of the realization taking shape inside my mind. For years, I had believed the greatest obstacle in my relationship with my father was his criticism. I was beginning to understand that criticism had only been the surface. Beneath it was something deeper. He had never truly viewed the company as an extension of my success. In his mind, it seemed to be something that should eventually come under his influence. That realization did not make me angry. It made me calm, very calm, because once you finally understand the game being played, you can stop reacting to individual moves and start planning your own. And for the first time since that meeting 3 weeks earlier, I began preparing for what might come next. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon. I had spent nearly 2 weeks quietly gathering information, reviewing documents, and listening more than I spoke. By that point, I had stopped hoping the evidence would point in a different direction. Every new detail seemed to confirm the same uncomfortable reality. Something significant was being planned, and my father was positioned at the center of it. That afternoon, I received a call from our outside legal counsel. The request seemed routine. A governance review had generated several questions, and they wanted clarification regarding company ownership structure and voting rights. Since I had personally established much of that structure years earlier, I agreed to meet immediately. What I expected to be a brief discussion turned into one of the most important conversations of my life. As we reviewed documents, one attorney paused and slid a folder across the table. He explained that several proposals had recently been submitted for preliminary review. Technically, there was nothing improper about the submissions. The problem was what they revealed. Inside the folder were draft recommendations outlining future leadership scenarios. My eyes moved slowly across the pages. Certain executive powers would be redistributed. Advisory authority would expand. New oversight mechanisms would be introduced. Individually, each recommendation appeared reasonable. Collectively, they created a clear outcome. The position of founder and chief executive would become increasingly limited. I continued reading until I reached a section describing a potential transition framework. There it was, not stated directly, but obvious to anyone paying attention. A path existed that could eventually remove operational control from me while preserving the appearance of organizational stability. For several seconds, I simply stared at the page. Years earlier, that discovery would have devastated me. Instead, I felt something unexpected. Clarity. Every confusing conversation suddenly made sense. Every unusual meeting, every subtle shift in authority, every attempt to undermine confidence in my leadership. The pieces finally fit together. The attorneys asked whether I had authorized the planning process. I told them I had not. Their expressions immediately changed. One of them carefully explained that while the proposals themselves were not binding, they indicated a coordinated effort to influence future governance decisions. When the meeting ended, I walked back to my office without speaking to anyone. Outside my window, employees moved through their normal routines. Phones rang. Meetings continued. Projects advanced. The company I had built was thriving. Yet behind the scenes, a different battle had been unfolding for months. That evening, I remained at my desk long after sunset. I thought about the first client who trusted me, the first employee I hired, the years of uncertainty, the sacrifices, the risks, the countless moments when quitting would have been easier. I thought about every time I had invited my father into my life, hoping he would finally see me differently. Then I thought about the folder sitting on my desk. The truth was impossible to ignore now. This was never about helping the company. It was never about mentorship. It was about control. For the first time, I stopped viewing the situation as a conflict between father and son. I started viewing it as a leadership challenge. And leadership required decisions based on facts, not emotions. I closed the folder, turned off the lights in my office, and headed for the elevator. By the time the doors opened on the ground floor, my mind was already moving toward the next step. I was no longer trying to understand what was happening. I understood it perfectly. The only question remaining was how I intended to respond. Once I accepted the truth, everything became simpler. Not easier, but simpler. For years, I had allowed emotion to cloud my judgment whenever my father was involved. I wanted approval. I wanted respect. I wanted the relationship we never seemed able to build. Those desires had influenced countless decisions. Now they were gone. What remained were facts. Facts are useful because they do not care about feelings. They simply exist. The morning after my meeting with legal counsel, I arrived at the office with a completely different mindset. I was no longer reacting to events. I was preparing for them. The first thing I did was assemble a small group of trusted advisors. Not executives looking for promotions. Not managers trying to gain influence. People who had demonstrated loyalty to the company itself. Karen was one of them. Daniel was another. Our outside legal counsel became a third. I did not share every detail immediately. Instead, I asked questions. I wanted to understand who knew what and when they had learned it. The answers were revealing. Several individuals had noticed unusual activity over the previous months. None had fully understood the larger picture. Together, however, their observations painted a remarkably consistent story. Influence was being consolidated. Relationships were being cultivated. Certain executives were receiving different messages depending on the audience. The strategy was sophisticated because it relied on perception rather than confrontation. No one was being forced to choose sides. They were simply being encouraged to imagine a future where leadership looked different. Over the next week, I spent more time listening than talking. I attended meetings. I reviewed reports. I observed interactions. The more I watched, the more confident I became. My father believed he was controlling the narrative. He believed people saw him as the experienced voice guiding the company toward stability. What he failed to recognize was that leadership inside an organization is not measured by visibility. It is measured by trust. And trust is earned over years, not manufactured through private conversations. One afternoon, I received an invitation to a strategic planning session that I had not requested. The attendee list immediately caught my attention. Several individuals connected to the governance proposals were included. My father would be leading the discussion. I accepted the invitation without hesitation. When the meeting began, I remained quiet. Harold spoke confidently about future growth, leadership continuity, and organizational evolution. The language sounded reasonable, professional, responsible. Yet beneath every recommendation was the same underlying assumption. Authority should gradually move away from the person who built the company. As I listened, something unexpected happened. I stopped feeling disappointed. I stopped feeling angry. Instead, I felt grateful. For the first time, everything was visible. There were no more questions, no more uncertainty. The strategy was finally out in the open. After the meeting ended, several executives approached me privately. They wanted reassurance. They wanted clarity. Most importantly, they wanted honesty. That moment taught me something important. People were not confused because they lacked information. They were confused because nobody had been willing to speak directly. So I did. Not publicly, not dramatically, just clearly. Over the following days, I began having individual conversations with key stakeholders. I shared facts. I explained the company structure. I answered questions. And little by little, uncertainty started disappearing. By the end of the week, I could feel momentum shifting. Not because I had attacked anyone. Not because I had defended myself. Simply because truth has a way of becoming powerful once people are finally allowed to see it. And while my father believed he was getting closer to achieving his objective, he had no idea that the foundation beneath his plan was already beginning to crack. The board meeting was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a Monday morning. By 8:30, the atmosphere inside the building felt different. People were professional as always, but there was a quiet tension beneath every interaction. Senior executives arrived earlier than usual. Board members gathered in small groups near the conference room. Everyone sensed that important decisions were approaching, even if they did not know the details. I arrived carrying a single folder. It was not thick. It did not need to be. The past several weeks had already provided everything necessary. Facts rarely require dramatic presentation. They simply require organization. As I entered the boardroom, I noticed my father seated near the center of the table. He appeared confident, relaxed, comfortable. The expression reminded me of countless moments from my childhood when he believed he already knew the outcome of a situation before it began. Several board members greeted me warmly. Others exchanged curious glances. The meeting started promptly. At first, the discussion followed the published agenda: financial performance, expansion opportunities, operational updates. Revenue continued to exceed projections. Customer retention remained strong. Employee satisfaction scores were the highest in company history. Every major indicator confirmed the same conclusion. The company was healthy, very healthy. Then the conversation shifted toward governance. That was when my father became noticeably more engaged. He spoke at length about leadership succession, organizational maturity, and long-term stability. His arguments sounded reasonable. In fact, that was precisely what made them effective. He never presented himself as someone seeking authority. He presented himself as someone protecting the company's future. Several proposals were introduced for discussion. Some of them were familiar. I had seen earlier versions during my review process. Others were newer refinements built upon the same foundation. As board members asked questions, I listened carefully. When my opportunity came, I stood and thanked everyone for their time. Then I opened the folder. What followed was not an attack. It was not emotional. It was not personal. I simply presented a timeline: dates, documents, meeting records, governance proposals, internal communications, strategic recommendations. One by one, the pieces connected. The board members quickly realized they were not looking at isolated events. They were looking at a coordinated effort to influence company direction without proper transparency. Several individuals asked clarifying questions. I answered every one of them directly. Our legal counsel then reviewed governance requirements and fiduciary responsibilities. The discussion lasted more than 2 hours. During most of that time, my father remained unusually quiet. For perhaps the first time in his life, he was not controlling the conversation. Eventually, one board member spoke words that changed everything. He said the company needed clarity, not competing centers of influence, not informal power structures. Clarity. Others agreed. The room gradually moved toward consensus. Formal votes were requested. Motions were introduced. Recommendations were reviewed. By early afternoon, the outcome was clear. Advisory privileges would be significantly reduced. Certain committees would be dissolved. Governance procedures would be strengthened. Most importantly, my father's role within the organization would come to an end. When the final vote concluded, silence filled the room. No celebration followed. No one smiled. No one applauded. This was not a victory anyone wanted. It was simply a necessary decision. As people gathered their materials and prepared to leave, I looked across the table at my father. For years, I had imagined what this moment might feel like if it ever came. I expected anger, satisfaction, relief. Instead, I felt something else entirely: acceptance. Because the most important battle had already been won long before the meeting began. The moment I stopped seeking his approval was the moment he lost the ability to control my future. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. Business continued. Projects moved forward. New clients signed contracts. Employees focused on their work. From the outside, everything looked normal. Yet for me, something fundamental had changed. For the first time in my life, I was no longer carrying the weight of trying to become someone my father would approve of. I did not realize how heavy that burden had been until it was gone. A few days after the board meeting, I met my mother for lunch again. We sat at the same restaurant near the river where we had spoken weeks earlier. The water moved slowly beneath the afternoon sunlight, and for a while we talked about ordinary things. Family, travel, work. Eventually she asked how I was holding up. I thought carefully before answering. The truth surprised even me. I told her I felt peaceful, not happy about everything that had happened, not proud of the outcome, just peaceful. She nodded as though she understood exactly what I meant. Then she said something I will never forget. She told me that some people spend their entire lives chasing approval from someone who is incapable of giving it. The tragedy is not that they never receive it. The tragedy is that they waste years believing their worth depends on it. On the drive back to the office, I thought about those words. I thought about the teenager who stayed up late studying because he wanted his father to be impressed. I thought about the young entrepreneur who worked 18-hour days hoping success would finally earn respect. I thought about the countless moments when I measured my value through someone else's opinion. Looking back, I could see how much energy I had devoted to a goal that was never really mine. Several months later, the company held its annual leadership conference. More than 100 employees gathered from across the country. During my keynote presentation, I stood on stage and looked out at faces representing every department, every level of the organization, and every chapter of our journey. Some had been with me almost from the beginning. Others had joined recently. Together, they represented something far greater than revenue reports or growth charts. They represented trust, commitment, shared purpose. Near the end of my speech, I spoke about leadership. I explained that real leadership is not about titles, control, or authority. It is about creating opportunities for other people to succeed. It is about helping others grow beyond your own limitations. As I spoke those words, I realized I was describing the exact opposite of the relationship I had spent years trying to repair. And strangely, that realization no longer hurt. After the conference ended, I returned to my office and stood once again beside the window overlooking the city skyline. The same skyline I had stared at years earlier from a tiny rented office. The same skyline I had watched after difficult setbacks and important victories. Only now, I saw it differently. Success was never the company. It was never the money. It was never the title on my business card. Success was learning that my value did not come from another person's approval. It came from the life I built, the people I helped, and the character I chose to keep along the way. The day my father left the company was not the day I won anything. The day I stopped needing him to tell me I was enough was the day I finally became free.